So good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you. My name is Anise Weaver, and I am the Associate Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Co-Director of the NCPAL program for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. On behalf of our EDI team within the department, led by Dr. Ernestine Briggs-King, I would like to introduce you to this exciting session we have planned for you today. In celebration of Latinx/Hispanic Heritage Month, two talented members of El Futuro's team, Molly Hayes and Dr. Juan Prandoni, are here with us and ready to present on the topic, cultural considerations when working with the Latinx community. Dr. Andi Diaz Stransky, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, will join the discussion for Q&A during the second half of today's presentation. So with that, Molly and Dr. Prandoni, welcome. Thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you, Anise, and everyone for having us. We're excited to be here with you today. I am running from one presentation to another, so I don't have my cool background that Juan has. And we are just coming off of our conference that we had last week. And Anise, we saw you popping in and out of our conference. So we're excited to share some information specifically here with you all in the Duke community. So we'll get started and just move through. We are hoping to cover a lot of material. We have so many things we would love to share with you. So this is a quick snapshot, but we want to talk through some terminology, history, and some points of inquiry for yourself as a practitioner or for a person who's interacting with the Latino community, the Latinx community. Thinking about treatment engagement considerations, when and why and how folks may or may not be coming into treatment, some specific cultural values of note that we've found to be helpful in being a service provider or practitioner working with this community. And then if we have time, we might talk about some frameworks that you can use to think through how to conceptualize care for the Latino community and what might be some approaches that you can take, and some guiding points. We would love to get to some Q&A, so we're going to save time for that because we love to be as interactive and dynamic as we can be. Luckily, we are here in the Durham area, in the North Carolina area, and so we also want to offer you ourselves as a resource moving forward, both in our formal activities that we have in terms of webinars and other things, trainings that we have scheduled throughout the year. And then informally, if you need any support, guidance, or consultation, Juan and I are here for you, and the rest of our La Mesita team, our El Futuro training team. So these are just some questions. These are open-ended questions for your consideration as you're engaging with the material and thinking through any questions that you might have, but just being curious about what does your panel of patients look like if you are treating patients, and why might that number be what it is? Why might that number be the percentage of your patient panel in regards to the Latinx community that you may or may not be engaging with? Just a point of curiosity. What might be some questions that you have that you haven't had an opportunity to ask or have asked, but maybe didn't quite get the answer you were looking for in relation to best practices with the Latinx community? And then some points of curiosity about what might be getting in the way of your work with this community in particular. Just some ideas, just idea generation to some degree here. So we're going to talk about terminology, and the reason we put quick in quotations is because nothing is quick when we talk about terminology, when we talk about the realities of working with a very vibrant and dynamic community, which is all communities. And we want to be upfront and honest to say this is a conversation that we are having at El Futuro always. We are always trying to be responding and respondent to the community's preferences, trying to be as engaging and as inviting and as incorporating as we can be, also knowing that we are working in a very vibrant and a very diverse cultural community. And so there's not really ever going to be a term or one term that's going to encapsulate all of the lived experiences your screen are some of the terms that have been attempted to use to put this community in a box or under one particular umbrella of terminology. So we have the term Hispanic, which is one term. We have the term Latino or Latina, which is another term. More recently, there's been some third and fourth terms that have come up, which is Latinx. And there are some reasons behind these newer terms. And as we know, vocabulary and language is always changing and is always moving and along with communities. But any and all of these terms can be a little complicated. And I'm sorry if my connectivity is a little bit tricky. Sometimes that happens here in our office. Juan will take it away from me if we need to. But Juan, do you want to go to the next slide so we can talk a little bit about the Latinx term? So the term Latinx was created to some degree to try to get to what is an inherently gender bias in the Spanish language. So the language of Spanish has gender specific nouns where one has to choose between being a female or a male. And the term Latinx was created to try to tend to that reality, which may or may not be inclusive of all peoples. So a third option was offered to replace the O or an A with an X to try to get to that shared history and the gender non-binary experiences of some parts of this community. So it was created to sort of be in solidarity, as you see here on the slide, but as with most terms, it has the potential to not be reflective of everyone and to may have erased the experience of some folks and or might be putting might be feeling like this isn't a term that I feel affiliated with, and other people have come and defined my community in these terms. And so we see this Pew study that comes out in 2019 that says, I don't know this term, I don't use this term. I don't really know that I like this term. So we're just in this, we're in this work, we're being curious, we're being attentive, we're being respondent. Figure out these ways. We can tell you where we are. Again, we have decided at El Futuro to take the term Latinx into usage for the time being and use it in our training and educational and consultation services and programming. We're working with academics, we're working with professional folks like yourselves. And so we're using this term for the now in our training and educational programs, but we are using this term not in our clinical practice. In our clinical practice, we are still using the terms Latino and Latina, or the term that a client might prefer to use. And we'll get to that a little bit. Juan, I saw you unmuted.
No, it's just because you froze. I was going to hop in, but okay. Yeah, this is a disclaimer that we put at the beginning of our programming, just stating like this is the call we're making, but we understand the ongoing discussion around this, and we want to make clear that this is not what we use with our clients.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of gets to this next point, which is the true realities of the Latinx community is it's incredibly varied. And most folks, what we find is they tend to be more aligned with their country of origin or their community of origin. So there's communities within communities within communities. So if you ask someone, Juan might say, well, I'm Argentinian. I'm not Hispanic or Latino, I'm from Argentina. You might have other folks who say, well, I'm muy Mexicano, or I'm from a particular, indigenous community within my community. We also have all these variations depending on your social economic status, your immigration context, how you or your family of history came to be in this community in North Carolina, to be here in the United States. why did you come here? What was the driving forces that brought you to this country? And then just remembering it's constantly changing. So this term Latinx has kind of been replaced by Latine, and we're thinking about being dynamic and changing our conversations here at El Futuro in that regard, but again, always evolving. So that's just, people ask this question a lot, and so we would like to get into the nuances, but we'll speak a little bit more about the realities of the Latinx identities, because it's important to think about the history. Like, how is it that there is this Latinx community? And again, very diverse, lots of different stories that we need to honor and to take into consideration. But the truth of the matter is that this part of the world was colonized by Europe. And so that includes us here in the United States, and that includes lots of different countries and regions of the world also being colonized by Spain. There was slavery, there was invasion, and we see that those same stories being played out in the Latin American culture as plays out here in the United States. So the same structural disadvantages being associated with white supremacy, with white being, the top of the pyramid, and we'll get into that in a moment. There's also a linguistic component of this. So there are many native existing cultures, languages, regional dialects all throughout this part of the world, including Latin America. There was more diversity in terms of this gender binary, so some fluid languages. So the Spanish coming into play with this gendered terminology of O and an A at the end of all nouns was an erasure of some pre-existing understandings of the gender fluidity. So we want to get to that when we're thinking through these things. And then being really clear that there is a history of colorism in this community that plays out.
I apologize, everyone. When she comes back, I might just tell her to pause and I'll take over. Okay. Seems like Molly has gotten kicked off. But as we've been talking about, this is born out of this history of colonization and subjugation of Native peoples. And you see this hierarchy coming over here in terms of a spectrum where at the top of the pyramid are folks that phenotypically look more white or more Spanish, and then at the bottom, more Black, Indigenous, African. And so there's this idea of mestizaje, which is the idea of like, oh, we're just this nice mix of cultures and ethnicities, and we don't have racism among Latinos, but it really obscures this hierarchy that is very present. We see colorism show up across the board within Latin American countries, and then also into folks who are living here in the United States, similar to what we see with African American communities, where there's light skin privilege, and folks at the bottom experience worser mental health and socioeconomic impacts. And you see this kind of embedded in Latino culture. You hear things from families, things like hay que mejorar la raza, or within families, the lighter skinned sibling being looked at more favorably, or sometimes there's terms of endearment in Latino culture where you'll be called by one aspect of yourself. So someone who's a little bit darker might be called negrita, or I think it's coming from Andi, even though she's muted. But
I'm sorry, I was trying to type the translation.
yeah, I don't know why you're muting, but it's still coming through. But no worries. So basically, when folks come to us and ask this question, we get asked, what term do I use? What's proper to use with Latinos? And the answer is we don't know. Just ask people, meet people where they're at. Because some people, as Molly was mentioning, might really recoil against the use of the term Latinx. Or Latine, they might just want to describe themselves as their nationality. So really, it's just best to ask folks and meet them where they're at. So we're going to shift now, and we talked a little bit about the some terminology issues. And so now we're going to get a little bit more into the practice and having an awareness of the sociocultural factors that come into play when servicing the Latinx community. And so we know that there's chronic underutilization among Latinos of mental health services in particular, with 1 in 5 seeking help from a doctor for a psychological disorder, and even fewer seeking them from an actual mental health professional. And then this goes even deeper when we're talking about immigrant Latinos, with fewer than 1 in 20 seeking help for these. And this is despite similar rates of mental illness. And we see these numbers still appear when we control for insurance coverage, for other SES markers. So there's something about the way that the interaction between the Latino community and our mental health system that leads to this underutilization. So Latinos are underutilizing, and they're also dropping out of treatment more prematurely, which means could indicate a dissatisfaction with services. And so we're going to get a little bit into why that might be. So presenting here a model. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it because of time, but Drs. Chavez Dueñas and Adames, they presented at our conference last week. Someone that we highly recommend you look into reading their books. They're very accessible, but they present this model of systemic and individual barriers, and they use this as a model for understanding why this underutilization might happen within the Latinx community. And they divide it into systemic barriers, so barriers within the system of mental health service provision, and then individual-based barriers. These are more barriers within the culture, so that interaction that I was talking about. And then how these things can look very differently depending on the individual differences around skin color, language, documentation status, socioeconomic status. So a mixture of that colorism that we presented earlier, and also the structural barriers that are imposed on Latinx immigrants in this country. And all of this is playing out within the specific sociocultural and historical context in which folks are living in. And so you might imagine in recent years with previous administration, and indeed this administration as well, these things can have deeper or more shallow impacts depending on the individual and their situation in life. And so going quickly into the systemic barriers, this is not exhaustive, but some important things to be aware of is that within the communities that Latinos may settle into, and immigrants, especially in an emerging immigrant context like the one we have here in North Carolina, where it's not a New York, a California, a Miami, the resources and availability of those and help for navigating these resources might be limited as well. There's also some institutional barriers, fear or mistrust because of documentation, limited insurance coverage, documentation issues for folks, really limiting what they feel is safe to seek out help for. And then we have a pretty severe shortage on the provider end in terms of having few bilingual providers, but even above that, folks that have multicultural competency and specific Latinx cultural competency to address the needs of this community. So that's where we might see some of the disengagement or the reticence to engage in services from this community when looking at when we look at the perceptions of systemic barriers, perceptions and the realities of the systemic barriers in our mental health system. And then going into the individual barriers, we can zero in on some differences in the way that Latinos conceive Latinos. I'm using broad terms here, but these are kind of stereotypical. And as you'll see, it's good to have an idea of what the stereotypes are, but then also really be culturally humble and ask questions to find out if these stereotypes apply or not. But bear with me on the stereotype front for now. So in terms of cultural beliefs, the Latinos tend to be more collectivistic, more and Western medicine turns to look at problems in a more biological, individualistic manner, whereas a Latino client might come to me and say, you know, I'm depressed because I had a fight with my mother. It might, and I really don't, I'm not on good terms with her, and I feel like I need to fix this, and this is why I'm feeling down. If I focus in on, well, you need to engage in some behavioral activation and you know, get out and do more things and establish a good sleep-wake cycle, that might go counter to the way that they're looking at their issue. There's also quite a bit of stigma within Latino community. You'll hear things like "es para locos" or "it's for crazy people." And so, especially in an emerging immigrant context like the one we have in North Carolina, where as an immigrant with limited community supports, you really rely on the folks around you, the community around you. And so sticking your neck out and seeking mental health and risking becoming ostracized from this community of support is a big risk and takes a lot of guts, a lot of courage. And so we really want to validate and be aware of that, and that this stigma, the messages that are received from parents, from folks in the community, from extended family, really can have a chilling impact on folks' desire to seek out mental health services. And because of this, oftentimes Latinos will prefer alternative sources of help. So folks in the community, faith healers, having tecitos or medicinal teas or herbs, those things can often feel more familiar rather than seeking help from a therapist or a psychiatrist. And so those things are sought sometimes before mental health services are provided. And in our practice, we recommend harnessing these and bringing them into our treatment, not disparaging them or saying, you know, why are you wasting your time with that? That's great. And let's see if you would also benefit from professional support as well. So let's bring it all together. And as I mentioned before, Latinos have different views on mental health etiology and then different views on how they might be treated. Whereas we might prefer more specific interventions that get at symptoms, they might prefer more social interventions or community-based interventions to manage these issues. So now I'm going to quickly go over some of the cultural values that are important to keep in mind. And the idea with this, hopefully, is that you'll get an idea of some of the main cultural values that come up. But hopefully, as you'll see when Molly gets to, hopefully if her connection cooperates, it's good to know some of these things, but it's not necessary to be an expert in these cultural values and their impacts. It's okay and beneficial to have some awareness of them, but then as always, the most important thing is being willing to ask and to learn from the person that's in front of you and seeing how much they endorse these values or not, how much these are implicated in the issues that you're working with folks on. So Latinos, as I mentioned, have this more collectivistic worldview versus the individualistic worldview, which prioritizes the collective over the individual, lots of reciprocal relationships, supports, and obligations. And this is a big one that flies in the face with a lot of my work with families, because kids have a lot of expectations. Kids raised in the US or who came here early or young, they have all these collectivistic expectations placed on them, but they have a more individualistic mindset, more Americanized mindset, and they're like, no, this isn't fair. I don't need to give all my earnings to my family. Like I shouldn't have to take care of my younger kids. And so we see a lot of the clashes on these different outlooks playing out within families, especially families where there's those acculturation gaps that take place, where kids adapt more quickly to US culture than their parents, and then that chasm gets created. And so this idea of self-sacrifice and the benefit of others, keeping your own complaints quiet in order to maintain harmony is something that's also valued. And as you can imagine, that can fly in the face of a lot of things that we do, where we really espouse the value of emotional expression and working through problems. And within the Latinx culture, sometimes that is not valued as much. So the value you probably hear the most about is familismo or familism, which is basically, it's not specific to Latinos, but Latinos exhibit it pretty strongly. And it is governed by these tenets: the subjugation of the self to the family interconnectedness, everyone helping each other out, maintaining family honor. I always remember my father telling me, just make sure the name Prandoni is respected. Make sure when people hear that name, like that you're honoring our family. And that's, I mean, to this day, it sticks with me. Really providing support and obligations to provide for the family. And this is a big one: unquestioning respect for parents and adults. So within families, we see this hierarchy where parents mandan, or parents are in charge, and kids accept silently, or they accept silently the authority of the parents. Which, again, if you imagine an American child or an Americanized Latino child, can lead to quite a bit of conflict. Respeto en vergüenza, or respect and shame. These are other pillars that uphold these kind of collectivistic outlooks within the culture. So respeto is this unquestioning deference to those higher on the social hierarchy. This goes for parents, but it also goes for professionals. Sometimes we get this as professionals where, excuse me, folks don't engage with treatment, or they don't express their dissatisfaction in treatment because they take our word as something to be respected and to not be contradicted. And so sometimes this can limit engagement in the work that we're doing. So it's good to open up those doors to say, you know, if I tell you something that doesn't jive with you, or you feel like the way we're doing therapy or the way we're providing you support or services isn't working, we want you to tell us. Sometimes just opening that door can create that space for folks to share discontentment. And vergüenza and shame, this is, again, that idea that sometimes when you go against the norms, you might feel guilt or individual guilt, but vergüenza here gets at more of you are shaming your whole family, you're shaming your whole culture. So it's these deeper senses of shame that particularly children are made to experience when they are rebelling or, you know, doing sometimes normative things as adolescents that the parents or the community does not support. And then we have simpatía and confianza. So simpatía is this idea of valuing harmony, not rocking the boat. Even if you have a difference of opinion, you keep it to yourself. And then also with confianza, Latinos generally seek a deeper level of trust and familiarity. They might invite you to events, they might bring you food and things like that. Always within reason. It's good to say yes, never say no when you're offered food or any kinds of gifts and things like that. It's just folks trying to maintain this simpatía and trying to build this confianza with you as their provider. You can see it as a sign of deeper engagement. And then we get into traditional gender roles. So one of the values here is Marianismo, which is based on this idea of particularly ascribed to women being like the Virgin Mary. And it has these 5 primary pillars. So women are the family pillars. is the main source of the family's strength. They have to be virtuous and chaste. They are subordinate to others. They suffer in silence to keep harmony, or they carry the weight or the burdens of the family. And they're also seen as spiritually and morally superior to men. And you can see that some of these things might be adaptive in terms of maintaining this collectivistic, this collectivistic outlook, the ability to nurture the family, the ability to be resilient in the face of adverse outcomes that are impacting the family. And there's obvious also maladaptive aspects in terms of dependency, passivity, and submissiveness. And it's a value that works within the culture, but this is my personal opinion. I think it also bears out. It is something that can serve to maintain the patriarchal nature of Latino culture. And oftentimes when women immigrate to the country, we see a kind of liberation away from this kind of value, because women engage in the workforce and at similar levels to men. They socialize more maybe than in the home country. And so we see a little bit of a lessening of this value. And that can fly in the face of machismo, which is the idea that men are superior to women, men are dominant, they are aggressive, they have low emotional expressivity. So those are all the maladaptive things that we typically associate with machismo. There's been some work recently, though, looking at some of the adaptive aspects, which is called caballerismo or gentlemanliness, which are the things that males, the positive things that males bring to the table, which is this idea of supporting the family, commitment to the family, being a provider. Even though these things typically are seen as like that's the man's role and the women's role is to be at home and take care of the family, there is some positive aspects within the culture in which this value can show up. So as Molly mentioned before, these values, so that kind of gives you a brief overview of the values, but these things are constantly changing through the process of acculturation. As folks immigrate to the country, they're adapting to life here. And they're adopting aspects of the host culture and also maintaining some aspects of their heritage culture. And so we see that culture has these different layers in terms of identifications, values, and then the actual practices like foods, who we associate with, music, television, etc. All those choices that individuals make a multifaceted individual identity along the lines of cultural identity. And it used to be that culture was believed to be like this early on. It was, you were not acculturated and then you assimilated into the culture that you immigrated into. That was then done away with. And then it was Barry's model in the 4 quadrants, where you can fall into these 4 boxes of integrated, you're a little bit of both, assimilated, you're all American and not very Latino, marginalized, you're kind of neither, and separated or segregated, where you're very Latino, but not, you're very Latino, but not very American. But it was then realized that this doesn't really make sense to put people into these 4 boxes. And really the prevailing view now on acculturation and cultural identity is that each individual has all these different things like English speaking preference, their orientation, their food preference, social preference, and they may be at different levels at different times. And these things are always changing. So again, hopefully the message comes through loud and clear that what we want to do is have an idea of what it might mean to be Latino, what they might stereotypically, how they might navigate the world, but we want to allow ourselves to have conversations and ask questions to get at this complexity, at this diversity that is inherent within each person that we meet. So Molly, hopefully your connection holds up. If not, I'll take over, but I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Juan, for that wonderful summary. Hopefully my connection will stay stable, and I'm going to run through this quickly because I do think it would be great to move to question and answer. But one of the frameworks that we have come to use heavily here at El Futuro in our educational programming and also in our clinical work is what we call the MECA framework. So the the multidimensional ecosystemic comparative approach, which is offered to us by Celia Falikov, who wrote this foundational book called Latino Families in Therapy. And she came out with a second edition fairly recently, and she's given talks with us before, and she's just wonderful in helping us think through how do we conceptualize all of these moving parts when working with a family or a client that's right in front of us. In our consultation room, in our exam room, or the like. So we've shortened it to be called the MECCA. And essentially it's just a framework that we can think through all of the pieces that we might want to take into consideration when just putting this together. What is this person's story? Who are they? How are they coming to share this information with me? And what do I want to take away from that? This might seem like a big picture. So if this is a little bit too much information, we understand that, but just know there's some key things that you could take away to use this in your practice. So she offers to us these two lenses of the MECCA, the cultural diversity lens and the social justice lens. And if we move forward, we can see that this cultural diversity lens kind of talks to us about who is this person and their family. And who is this person and who is this family in their culture, in their experience, and their lived history. So this gives us an experience. We can understand how is this family structured? Is this family structured very traditionally or dynamically or some combination? And this can give you what they call the internal cultural landscape of this person in context. And we can pair that with the social justice lens, which has to do with the macro story of how did this person come to be in this space in this time and in what way. So we talked about that migration process. How was it that this person or their family or their history came to be related to both their history, their country of origin, and here in the United States? What is that cultural component telling us? And so how dynamic is that? How are those dynamic pieces playing together? And then what is the ecological context? So this SES and the community that you live in, and how are all of those things playing together to give that external cultural landscape. So we can take all of these pieces and put them together and really have a dynamic, attuned understanding of who is this person sitting in front of me, wanting to engage in whatever service I have to offer. And so these stances, which we think are really helpful, is just to put yourself in this mind frame. And this is probably helpful thinking with any client and sitting with any client, really trying to work to understand what is their story, what is both what Falikov calls the universal story and what is unique about this situation. So that dialectic of being both and at the same time, taking what I know or have come to understand or what has been taught to me about the universality of this community and then the uniqueness of your situation. Taking the knowledge that I have and then pairing that really heavily with curiosity and respect. And then getting back to that original comment that we had, if you don't know, please ask. If you don't know, be curious. This is a relationship that we're building with clients and really wanting to get to this pairing of the knowing and the non-knowing. And then as always, really moving away from the deficit model, thinking what is wrong with you or how are you not interacting in all of these resources that you have access to, and refocusing that in terms of resilience and strength. So moving towards how are the ways that you've been really successful in getting to where you need to be, despite some things that might have been challenging. By the nature of someone sitting in your exam room, having a conversation with you, with or without an interpreter, is really something to be highlighting as a strength. And so capitalizing on that trusting relationship with us as professionals, with us as providers, with us as the doctoras or doctores in their world, we can really see that as strength and a desire to make a relationship work. these are two fundamental books that we use here to help support our work at El Futuro. So we talked about Adames and Chavez. I put in the link, their most recent book, Succeeding as a Therapist. We just got our copies on board. That's a very, very new book. So we haven't explored it in more detail other than what they've shared with us. So these are two great places to research more. They both have very dynamic relationships with social media and things that you can explore in more depth if that's interesting to you. Juan and I often have the caveat that we're both behavioral health experts. And so we live in this space. We are not medical care providers. And so we can provide the best information we can in that space. But we do want to pair that with your expertise on board. And that's why we were excited to have Dr. Andi Diaz Stransky here to help us kind of round out our knowledge base here as we move into some Q&A. So I'll pause here. Juan, you can just run through this slide because I think this is kind of self-explanatory. You can go back and we'll pause here to see if there's any questions that have bubbled up, and Dr. Diaz Stransky is going to help facilitate that for us.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I learn every time that I attend La Mesita or I hear you guys. So we'll give some time for people to type in the chat if they have questions. I know I have some questions along the way, so I can also chime in.
Also happy for folks to just speak their questions if that's easier.
So to get us started, one question that I've been pondering with recently that I was hoping you could share your experience on is during the pandemic, the hopes that we would close the gap, we would increase access to care, all of a sudden people can access therapy online. What has that been like for the Latinx population that you work with, and has that really closed the gap?
Juan, I'll take that away if you don't mind. We have really, I'm trying to pause and see how far back to answer that question. So we were piloting a telehealth program prior to COVID, and we were really excited about the ways that telehealth might be able to bridge the gap. And then COVID, of course, pushed that forward, that timeline way forward. And I will speak to our rural health initiative, and then Juan, if you want to chime in also from your clinical practice. But we're finding yes, telehealth has allowed us to get access to more folks in a way that has seemed to bridge the gap of cost and transportation and access to some degree. And we're finding that there are real technological limitations in communities that either don't have strong Wi-Fi, don't have strong cell service, don't have access to the technology, and really maybe aren't as technologically savvy as some other communities. I will say that one of the things that we do at El Futuro is we do a lot of patient education up front. And so we teach folks how to get on Zoom before they come even close to talking with a provider. So they've had many training sessions, or we've had confirmation that that's been a success point for them before they're in the session with their provider, where the pressure feels really high to get online and to be having success in that session. So we've kind of been able to troubleshoot, but it's not attending to the structural issues, which is some folks just don't have access to strong enough Wi-Fi or the technology to be able to support virtual sessions. Juan, does that play out in your sessions?
Yeah, I think we've seen that I've seen that in my direct clinical work. We saw that COVID increased disparities, and a lot of the folks within the Latinx community were still going out and doing those forward-facing jobs at times where some of us were able to stay at home, and the stress and mental health impacts of that definitely were evident. Kids not doing as well with remote learning and the stresses that brought on families. So we saw an increase probably in need. And I personally have seen like an increase in access for some folks, and particularly those that are working long hours. It's really easy to take a lunch break and for them to go into their car and pull out their phone and have an hour-long session with me. And that's something that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And with certain age groups, I've found that with my Latinx clients, I'm able to build, like some of my clients that I have really close bonds with, I've never met in person. But that bond, that simpatía, that confianza, I've found is still able to be built through a teletherapy appointments. That is, I think, contingent on age. So the younger folks, as you might imagine, it's very difficult. I would say probably 12 and under, difficult to engage them sometimes, especially when we're talking about kids with behavioral issues, ADHD, et cetera. And then I've had older folks as well. If there's some support from the family in terms of getting the technology up and running, it can work. But still also, I find that with those folks, they value that face-to-face contact that you get from an individual's live therapy session. So I think it has increased access, but only for some in some cases.
Thank you. We're seeing a lot of excellent presentation. Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. Sounds like people are getting a lot out of everything you shared. And as we wait for other questions to come along, another question I have for you is, do you have a practical pitch for patients that you could share with us, for Latinx patients, to encourage them to engage in treatment? You know, when they really are not so sure, they don't want to be loca or crazy. What's your pitch?
Go for it, Juan.
I think it's tough to say like a one pitch, because again, going with that idea of meeting people where they're at, I think the pitch is, or the way that I approach it, is to use kind of an acceptance and commitment approach, which basically helps you to meet the person where they're at in terms of what they value. So I say, like, what are important things to you in your life that maybe this mental health stuff is getting in the way of, you know, or I don't say mental health stuff, but, you know, like, what are some things that you wish you could be doing, but right now, because of your nervios or your nerves, you're not able to do, or because of the trauma reminders, these things are getting away. So I have some things that might be able to help you to get those things back, the things that are important to you, being able to share meals with your family, getting your kid on board and not feeling like you have to be like a general at home and yelling at them all the time to do things, like improving those things that you value the most. And I feel like that's when you create buy-in, when you are able to come alongside and show a deeper understanding of the things that they value, rather than just focusing on the symptoms and a prescribed treatment. So when they see, oh, this person gets me, and they see what's important in my life and that it's my family and they're going to help me improve these things that are important to me, then I can find a little bit more engagement. Molly, I don't know about you on your end.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with my practice. And I think we've worked to sort of, Juan, I think you got to it, not saying mental health so much, and maybe saying bienestar emocional, so mental wellness or a healthy behavioral wellness. So using some destigmatized terms helps. And then also taking the approach of a developmental reality that everyone could possibly benefit from support at some point in our lives. And you can use examples, or you can use examples from your own life if you're willing to be that vulnerable, or you can use examples of, if you're coming for your child, wouldn't it have been helpful if you had that kind of support, where it have been available or accessible in the time period where you needed it. So using those personal examples, or hooking onto an internal motivation, like Juan was saying.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think self-disclosure is really important with that idea of confianza, of simpatía. Like, I often like to humanize myself and say, you know, I have anxiety and I take medication for it. And it helps. I think this anxiety medication helps me live life more closely to the ideal, the way I see it, right? It allows me to suffer less. And I find that really helpful. So sometimes not see the clinician as infallible or perfect, and to see them as human, I think can be really important, particularly for this population.
Yeah, no, agreed. Along those lines of meeting people where they're at and what their interests, I find that oftentimes it's around a somatic complaint, so back pain or headaches or something like that. And so not dismissing that, but including that as part of the goal can be helpful. With that, a question that I got here is, what kind of language do you use when asking a client or patient to self-identify their cultural identity?
I think just very simple. How do you like to be called? Do you prefer, I would, and they might be like, not understand what that means, and say, do you want me to say like you're a Latino or you're Hispanic, and just ask? Or do you prefer your country of origin?
Anise asks, how do you manage providing effective mental health in the face of such significant structural and systemic barriers?
This is a great question, and it's tricky. And I think we try to rely a lot. I try to rely a lot on hope, and also that resilience factor. Really developing the internal motivations for how folks came to be where they are, and hooking into that as being a point of strength, and also a point of potential suffering. I'm going to use that word. It's a tricky one. But also recognizing that, as I said before, if someone's already come to your room, they've come a long way, and there's already some internal motivation to work on, despite the fact that there are some systemic barriers in place. There is a social justice component here, an advocacy component here. So working within your systems, if you're able to access additional resources or grant funding or other supports. Also trying to not be working in a vacuum. So if you are the only one who's Spanish speaking in your practice, or if you are one of the few folks who is developing a Latino specialty, connecting with other folks so that you can share resources, you can share ideas, you can share your experiences, so that you can continue to work inside that space of hope.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, I think because of the structural and systemic barriers, sometimes it can feel overwhelming. And I think it's a mixture of stepping outside of your specific domain and maybe providing, like I provide therapy primarily, but I also do some social work or some advocacy within immigration lawyers and things of that sort. And so it takes a little bit of doing that, but just being mindful of not overdoing it too, and making sure you reach out to community resources. If you have case management resources, which I'm very grateful to have at El Futuro, so you don't lift the load on your own. And then I think part of it too is just, we talked about this concept in our conference of moral distress, which is the idea where like it kind of goes beyond burnout. So you can get burned out by having like a tough caseload and or a heavy caseload and limited hours to work and things like that. But when there are systemic or structural things that prevent you from being able to do what you feel is your calling, which is, service provision in whatever discipline you're engaged in, that can feel discouraging on a moral level. And so sometimes it can be helpful to just say, we're doing the best we can. The obstacles are fairly large and often systemic, and we're only capable of providing individual level supports. And so it's not a solution, but kind of like an acceptance stance to the difficulties of this work can be helpful in terms of being able to stick with it despite these obstacles.
Yes, it can be really overwhelming. The other piece is to remember the value of social capital, so including family members to support that patient. So partners matter, grandma, grandpa, whoever you can involve can be quite helpful.
But being mindful that the identified patient wants that.
Oh, of course, yeah, making sure.
Yeah, sometimes we can assume, oh, Latinos, family, just bring everyone into the treatment room, and they might not want that.
No. Yes. All right. I think we have a couple minutes left for anyone that has any final burning question.
I have a thought that's not fully developed, but I'm gonna put it out there and just see. So really good job, you two. A good portion of my job is working with cancer patients through the Do Cancer Institute, and we get our referrals directly from providers. And so kind of one of the things that I'm thinking through is when I look at, and I don't have it in front of me, but when I think about our referral list, it's a pretty low percentage of them are from the Latinx population. And thinking about your talk and about maybe like, you know, taking doctor's word for like period for the word, are we potentially missing out on a large portion of people who could need or potentially want services, but not be asking for it because they're sitting in this doctor's appointment and the doctor is saying, you're going to be okay, everything is going to be fine. And would there be anything you recommend to, whether it's like a handout in Spanish or a pamphlet in Spanish or something that everybody is getting that might break down one of the barriers to accessing care?
I will attempt to answer your question, but I would love to hear from folks in your system too. So this is a real systems level consideration. And we know, as Juan highlighted in his slide, the Latinx community is just not accessing services at the same rate, despite the same prevalence of the concerns. And that is, I mean, we can think about lots of different reasons for that, but that is partially because folks oftentimes don't feel welcome. And so the question is, how do we help folks feel welcome in all of the spaces? And so we don't have a specific answer for that, because I think it really depends on what efforts has your community taken already to engage with the Latinx community, be it, you know, pamphlets, or your website is bilingual, or your front desk staff are bilingual, or your provider is really able to make that a warm referral, right? So is that helpful? Are they walking you through, and here, when you go, here's what you might encounter, here's what you might see. I will plug a little bit of program that we have started here at El Futuro, which is implementation and implementation strategies, where we try to help organizations identify what are some key goals that they might be wanting to work on to provide increased accesses for, specifically for mental health services, but for the Latino community. So that we call it ALMA, which is Advancing Latinx Mental Health here at El Futuro. And so we can work with your organization or your department to sort of walk through what are some spaces where you might be succeeding, what are some spaces where you might be able to grow, and we can help you take steps towards that goal. I see Dr. Briggs King had some resources here in the chat, but also I see Dr. Diaz Stransky is nodding her head, maybe with some ideas.
Oh, I'm just thinking you're giving us a lot to think about, and some really good directions to go on. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and we just want to highlight that it's complicated, and so we appreciate any dynamic thought in this regard towards increasing access for care for folks.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really good question to end on, to give us something to continue thinking about as we move ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, fearless presenters, for coming into this space with us and sharing so much useful information. We're very, very appreciative. And thank you everybody who was able to carve out time in their schedule for being here with us. Clearly, we would love to have you back, you know, as we recognize that this is a conversation that certainly should be continued from this month on. So I'm seriously thanking you very much for your time and your expertise around this very important topic. And thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for taking your time to be with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.